You just handcuffed the U.S. Attorney General." The words hung in the air like a bell that had stopped ringing, and for a second no one in the crowded airport lounge knew whether to breathe or blink. Outside the tall glass walls, a late afternoon rain turned the runway into a sheet of silver, and inside the soft hum of travelers rolling suitcases and distant boarding announcements made the moment feel strangely unreal, like the entire building had leaned in to listen. The woman at the center of it all stood perfectly still. She was dressed simply in a charcoal coat, dark slacks, and polished shoes that looked more expensive than flashy. In her hand was a leather folder worn at the edges with a small government seal pressed into the corner, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. Her phone had been quiet all afternoon, except for one missed call from an unlisted number, and she had not once seemed nervous. Not once raised her voice. Across from her, Officer Travis Hale looked like a man who had already decided the story in his own head. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impatient in the way some men become when they mistake a badge for wisdom. He had stopped her near the security corridor, asked for identification with a tone that carried too much confidence and not enough respect, then frowned when she didn't immediately comply. Now he was standing a little too close, his jaw tight, his hand resting near his belt, as if proximity alone could make him right. "Ma'am, I said I need to see your ID," he repeated louder this time, trying to turn control into authority. The woman met his eyes without flinching. "You already have what you need," she said calmly. That answer seemed to irritate him more than a refusal would have. A few travelers slowed as they passed. A young mother pulled her son a little closer. A businessman in a navy suit paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth. And in that widening circle of silence, Travis made the mistake that would define everything that followed. He reached for her arm and guided her toward the side wall, the kind of gesture meant to remind a person who was in charge. "Let's go," he said. "We're done here." But the woman didn't move like someone defeated. She moved like someone patient. She lowered her folder to the counter, opened it just enough for the gold lettering inside to catch the light, and then looked past him toward the nearest security camera. "Officer Hale," she said, her voice even almost gentle, "before you do anything else you should call your supervisor." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "My supervisor, yes," she said. "And after that you should call the airport director." The tone in her voice was not angry. It was worse. It was certain. Travis glanced at the folder, then at the camera, then back at her face. For the first time, a faint crack showed in his expression, small but visible like ice, beginning to split. Still, he tried to hold the room with attitude alone. "You think a folder changes anything?" he asked. She finally smiled, but only a little. "No," she said. "My name does." Then she closed the folder and set it on the counter with quiet finality, as if placing a verdict down before the court. On the front page, in bold black letters, was a title that made the nearby security guard go rigid. The businessman lowered his coffee. The young mother's eyes widened, and Officer Hale, who had spent the entire encounter acting like he owned the moment, suddenly looked as if the floor beneath him had shifted by a few inches. "Read it," the woman said. He did, and when the color left his face, the whole airport seemed to go still with him. He stared at the folder like it had just started breathing on its own. His jaw tightened. His shoulders shifted. Around them, the airport noise seemed to blur into something far away, as if the entire terminal had stepped back to give the moment room. The businessman near the coffee stand no longer pretended not to listen. The young mother kept one hand on her child and one eye on Officer Hale, afraid to move, afraid to blink. Hale finally reached for the folder with slow, reluctant fingers, as if touching it might make the truth inside become even more real. He opened it. One page. Then another. His eyes moved once, then stopped. The confidence in his face drained so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Somewhere behind him, a security camera hummed softly, recording every second of the silence. The woman did not rush him. She simply stood there in that same calm posture, one hand resting on the counter, the other loose at her side, as if she had already seen the end of this story and knew there was no reason to hurry. Hale looked up, then back down, then up again, this time with the kind of disbelief that only appears when a person realizes the ground they were standing on was never solid. That cannot be right, he said, but even his voice sounded smaller than before. The woman held his gaze. It is right, she said. And you know it. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving beneath the collar of his uniform. For the first time he seemed to notice the quiet around him the way people had started watching, not with fear now, but with that tense waiting silence that always comes before a room decides who deserves to stand and who does not. The airline employee behind the desk shifted from one foot to the other, hands frozen near the keyboard. A man in a gray suit lowered his phone, no longer recording casually, but deliberately. Even the little boy near the gate stopped fidgeting and looked over with wide, curious eyes, sensing that something important was unfolding without understanding why. Hale turned one page again, as if the answer might change if he looked at it from a different angle. It did not. His face hardened for a brief second, not with power this time, but with the weak stubbornness of a man trying to hold together a collapsing pride. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked. "I expect you to read what is in front of you," she replied. Her tone never rose. That was the worst part for him. She did not need volume. She did not need threats. Her certainty was enough. It filled the space more completely than shouting ever could. He looked at the title page again, and then the signature beneath it, and then the official seal that sat there with quiet authority. His fingers loosened around the folder. For a moment, he looked less like an officer and more like a man standing in the path of a truth he had spent his whole career pretending did not exist. The woman saw it happen. She saw the exact moment the performance cracked. Not all at once. Just a thin line. But enough. Enough to know that what came next would matter. "You kept calling me a delay," she said softly. "A problem. A person to move out of the way. You never once asked who I was." Hale did not answer. He could not. The coffee in the businessman's hand had gone cold. The mother's expression had softened into something almost sorrowful. Not for Hale. For the lesson he was only now beginning to understand. The woman stepped closer, not threatening, not loud, simply present, and that presence made the whole counter feel smaller. "This airport," she said, "does not belong to you. This line does not belong to you. And that attitude you have been wearing like a shield will not protect you from the truth." Hale's lips parted, but no words came out. She let the silence sit there between them for one long, punishing beat. Then she reached into her coat pocket, took out a second card, and placed it beside the folder. The man in the gray suit leaned in first. His eyes widened almost immediately. The security guard straightened so fast it looked involuntary. Hale saw their reactions and finally truly saw what was happening. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. It was not this kind of quiet authority, the kind that did not need to announce itself because the room itself seemed to recognize it. The woman watched his face change again. "Now," she said, "you may keep pretending, or you may do the one honest thing left to you and step aside." Hale looked at her. Then at the card. Then at the folder. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. And in that tiny, humiliating pause, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath with him. For a moment, no one in the terminal moved. The hum of the lights overhead seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the quiet weight of that second card lying beside the folder. Hale stared at it as if the small piece of plastic had somehow become larger than the room itself. The man in the gray suit had gone rigid. The security guard, who had been ready to bark another order only seconds earlier, now looked like he was trying to remember how to breathe. The woman did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply stood there with the same calm, measured stillness, and that stillness carried more force than anger ever could. "You see," she said, her tone even and clear. "Some people spend their whole lives assuming that confidence belongs to the loudest person in the room. It does not. Sometimes it belongs to the person who has already read the room, already read the file, and already decided how this is going to end." Hale swallowed hard. The words landed one at a time, each one precise, each one impossible to dismiss. He glanced toward the nearby passengers, pretending not to watch, but it was too late. They were watching. They had been watching for several minutes now. A young mother near the benches had stopped rocking her child. A businessman holding a coffee had lowered it halfway to his mouth and forgotten to drink. Even the gate agent at the desk had turned slightly, drawn in by the strange gravity spreading through the terminal. The woman opened the folder and turned one page just enough for Hale to see a name, a seal, and a signature that made his face drain of color. He read it once, then again. His shoulders sank. The folder was not a complaint. It was not a warning. It was a record. A complete one. Every report, every camera log, every name, every time stamp, arranged neatly, patiently, as if the truth had been waiting all along for the right moment to be placed on the table. The gray suit man took a cautious step back. The security guard's eyes flicked to Hale, then to the woman, then down to the floor. Nobody in that circle wanted to be the first to speak now, because speaking would mean choosing a side, and the room already knew which side had the truth. Hale's lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked smaller now, not because anyone had touched him, but because certainty had finally entered the room and made all his posturing look cheap. The woman let the silence stretch again. She was not rushing him. She was giving him something rare. Time to understand. "I did not come here to embarrass you," she said quietly. "If that were my goal, this would already be over. I came here because what happened at this gate matters, because people remember how authority behaves when it thinks no one important is looking, and because every person in uniform, every person with a badge, every person entrusted with power should know that character is revealed in the moments they think they can be careless." Hale looked at the floor. His jaw tightened. The shame on his face was no longer anger. It was recognition. The kind that arrives too late and cannot be reasoned away. The woman closed the folder with a soft tap. It sounded final. "Step aside," she said again. Still calm, still controlled, and let the truth do what it was meant to do. Hale did not move at first. The silence between them had become its own kind of testimony, and everyone in the terminal seemed to feel it. Travelers slowed. A gate agent looked up from a scanner and then looked away again. Somewhere behind the glass, a plane taxied under a gray sky, its engines low and steady, as if the world itself had learned to keep quiet. Hale swallowed hard and finally stepped back half a pace. It was a small motion, but in that moment it looked enormous. The woman did not smile. She did not need to. She had never raised her voice. She had never needed to. She simply stood there with the same unshaken calm, the folder resting at her side, her eyes level, her presence impossible to dismiss. When she reached into her coat and withdrew her identification, the air changed, not because she was trying to impress anyone, because the name on that badge carried weight in rooms like this, and because people like Hale knew the difference between routine authority and the kind that could end a career with a phone call. He stared at the badge, then at her face, and something in him seemed to fold inward. The woman spoke again, and now her tone was softer, almost regretful. "You were given a chance to see what was in front of you," she said. "Instead, you chose suspicion. You chose disrespect. You chose to speak to a citizen as if dignity were something only certain people deserved." Hale's lips parted, but no words came. There was no defense left that could survive the truth standing in front of him. His hands hovered uselessly at his sides, and for the first time since this began, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone realizing the ground beneath him was never as solid as he believed. She glanced toward the witnesses gathered near the gate, then back at him. "That is the cost of prejudice," she said. "It never stays small. It spreads. It hums through every decision. It reaches the people around you. It teaches them what kind of authority you think you have. And eventually it brings you to a moment like this where the truth no longer asks permission to be heard." A child nearby leaned into a mother's side. An older man lowered his newspaper. Even the gate agent had stopped pretending not to listen. Hale felt every set of eyes on him, and none of them offered sympathy. Not because the crowd was cruel, but because they had all seen enough to understand what had happened here. The woman slipped the badge back inside her coat and lifted the folder slightly. "This is not about humiliation," she said. "It is about accountability. It is about making sure that when someone is judged by the color of their skin, their accent, or the quiet way they carry themselves, there is still a record, still a witness, still a consequence." Hale nodded once barely. The movement looked involuntary, like his body was beginning to accept what his pride could not. She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned slightly toward the gate where the path forward remained open. "Step aside," she repeated, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that seemed to settle over the entire terminal. Hale exhaled through his nose and moved. Not because he had suddenly become noble, because the truth had left him nowhere else to stand. The woman walked past him with measured steps, her shoes quiet against the polished floor, and the people watching her instinctively made room. No one told them to. They simply understood. There are moments when power does not announce itself with shouting or force. Sometimes it enters a room wearing patience. Sometimes it carries itself with grace. Sometimes it waits until the loudest person has talked himself into disgrace, and then it lets the silence expose everything. Hale watched her go, and the shame on his face deepened into something heavier, something more lasting. Not fear, not anger, awareness. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. He had mistaken calm for surrender. He had looked at a woman standing alone and assumed she had no backing, no voice, no reach. And now the lesson stood before him in plain sight. The people who are easiest to underestimate are often the ones who understand justice best. The woman reached the edge of the gate and paused just long enough to speak without turning back. "Remember this," she said. "A badge can open doors. It can also close them. But character is what people remember after the badge is gone." Then she continued forward, and the terminal, which had been frozen in that moment of truth, slowly began to breathe again. But nothing was quite the same. Not for the witnesses, not for the staff, and certainly not for Hale. Because some encounters end with apologies. Others end with consequences. And the ones that change a person forever are the ones where justice arrives quietly, looks you in the eye, and refuses to flinch. For a long moment after the terminal settled, no one seemed willing to move first. The officers who had been loud only minutes earlier now stood with their eyes lowered, as if the floor had suddenly become the safest place to look. Hale remained near the gate, his radio quiet in his hand, his jaw tight, his pride thinner than the paper in his pocket. Across from him, the woman did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply stood with the same calm that had carried her through every insult, every delay, every attempt to reduce her to nothing. And that calm now felt heavier than anger. It filled the air. It pressed on the room. It made every witness understand that what had happened here would not disappear just because everyone wished it would. A nearby traveler, still clutching a rolling bag, whispered to his wife. She never once raised her voice. The wife shook her head slowly. "That is what makes it worse," she said. She did not have to. Hale heard the words, and for the first time he seemed to realize that silence could testify louder than any argument. He had spent years believing authority meant control, that a badge gave him the right to decide who mattered and who did not. But standing there now in the bright, ordinary light of the terminal, he looked less like a man in command and more like a man who had finally met the limit of his own assumptions. The woman turned slightly, just enough for him to see the expression in her eyes. It was not hatred. It was not triumph either. It was something harder to endure. It was disappointment sharpened by truth. "You kept telling yourself I was alone," she said evenly. "That is where you made your mistake." Hale swallowed hard, unable to answer. Because she was right, and he knew it. He had mistaken composure for weakness. He had mistaken dignity for surrender. He had mistaken patience for permission. And now, every one of those errors stood against him like a verdict. The supervisor, who had arrived moments earlier, glanced at the report in his hand, then back at Hale, and the weight of the situation settled deeper into the room. There would be statements. There would be reviews. There would be calls no one could ignore. But even before any official response came, the real consequence had already begun. It lived in the faces around them. In the way the staff no longer looked at Hale with respect but with disbelief. In the way the travelers no longer looked at the woman as someone to be managed but as someone to be remembered. That is how justice often moves. Not with thunder first, but with clarity. Not always with spectacle but with exposure. It reveals who people are when the room is watching. It reveals who they become when power is no longer enough to protect them from the truth. Hale finally lowered his radio. The small motion seemed to cost him more than he expected. He took one breath, then another, and for the first time his voice was not sharp. It was thin, almost human. "Ma'am," he said. But the word landed awkwardly, stripped of the confidence he had once worn like armor. The woman did not interrupt him. She let the silence do its work. She let him feel the full weight of being seen without being defended. By rank, by tone, or by the easy cruelty of an unchecked moment. And in that silence, the lesson became impossible to miss. Some people think power is proven when others step aside. But real power is revealed when someone has every reason to fall apart and chooses instead to stand with grace. Real power does not need to shout. It does not need to humiliate. It does not need to win every room by force. It only needs the truth and the courage to remain standing when the truth arrives. By the time the first call was made to review what had happened, the terminal had already changed. Not because the lights shifted, not because the crowd moved on, but because every person who witnessed that moment now carried it with them. And Hale, who had walked into the day believing he understood authority, would leave it with a new kind of memory. One that would return to him in quiet moments and remind him that character outlives rank and dignity outlasts fear. That is the part no badge can erase. That is the part no apology can fully replace. And that is the part he would remember long after the terminal doors closed behind her. The call had already gone out by the time Hale reached the glass wall overlooking the terminal, but the message did not sound like panic. It sounded measured, controlled, almost careful, as if the people making it were trying to keep the entire building from understanding how serious the moment had become. Below him, the passengers who had stopped to watch were still standing in the same places, their faces turned toward the center of the concourse. Their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet embarrassment. Marin stood there without moving her posture, straight her hands, calm at her sides, the very picture of a woman who had no need to perform strength, because strength was already part of how she carried herself. That was what unsettled people most. Not anger, not outrage. Calm. The kind of calm that made everyone else feel how loud they had been. Hale looked down at the scene and felt the first real crack in the certainty he had worn all day. He had expected confusion to fade once the crowd dispersed. He had expected embarrassment to soften into a story people would tell only in fragments. Instead, what he saw was something far more permanent. He saw memory forming in real time. He saw the moment settling into the minds of strangers who would carry it home, replay it later, and wonder why dignity had been the one thing most difficult for them to recognize in the first place. Near the service desk, one of the supervisors kept speaking into a phone with a voice that had gone thin and careful. Another employee stood beside him, no longer eager to explain, no longer eager to point, no longer eager to decide who belonged and who did not. They had all heard the exchange. They had all seen the pause before Marin spoke. And that pause had changed the atmosphere more than any accusation ever could. Because in that silence, she had not begged. She had not tried to prove herself to people who were not ready to understand. She had simply allowed the truth to exist in the room. And truth, once spoken clearly, has a way of making every false assumption look smaller than it felt a minute before. Hale swallowed and kept his eyes on her. For the first time, he understood that authority without wisdom is only noise wearing a uniform. He understood that respect cannot be demanded from people whose trust has already been broken, and he understood something even harder to accept. Marin had not needed his permission to matter. She had not needed his approval to stand where she stood. The terminal had taught him that lesson without raising its voice. Around them the bright overhead lights still shone, The announcement still rolled gently across the speakers. The rolling suitcases still moved. But the room felt different now, as if everyone inside had stepped over a line they could not unsee. A woman near the seating area quietly pulled her child closer. An older man shook his head once, not in anger but in disappointment at how easily a person can mistake position for worth. Marin remained still, and in that stillness there was something larger than triumph. There was restraint. There was grace. There was the kind of victory that does not ask to be celebrated, because it already knows what it has protected. Hale remembered the tone of her voice. He remembered how steady it had been when everything around her was trying to make her seem smaller, and he remembered with a sting that would stay with him that she had never once lowered herself to the level of the moment. She had risen above it. By the time the first official review was requested, the story had already spread through the terminal in quiet pieces carried from one witness to the next by lowered voices and stunned expressions. No one was cheering. No one needed to. The lesson was already there, plain enough for anyone willing to see it. Real power does not need to perform. It does not need to bruise the room to prove it exists. It does not need to humiliate in order to be heard. It stands. It speaks the truth. And when the truth finally arrives, every false version of authority begins to collapse on its own. Hale knew that would stay with him long after the glass doors closed, and the crowd moved on. Some memories fade with the day. This one would not. This one would return in the quiet hours when the building was empty and the noise had gone. It would remind him that a badge can open doors, but character decides what kind of person walks through them. And it would remind him over and over that dignity is never made smaller by being tested. It only becomes more visible. Hale remained still for a moment after the room emptied, listening to the soft hum of the courthouse settle back into its ordinary rhythm. The tension that had filled the air only minutes before was gone, now replaced by the quiet rustle of papers, the distant echo of footsteps, and the low murmur of people who understood they had just witnessed something larger than a single confrontation. Across the hallway, the man who had once carried himself with easy arrogance no longer looked certain of anything. He stood near the marble wall, shoulders stiff, eyes lowered, as if the weight of what had been said to him was finally beginning to land. Not with spectacle, not with drama, just truth, steady and unavoidable. Imagine standing there in that same silence, feeling the room remember every word you tried to bury. That was the kind of silence that changes a person. It strips away the noise and leaves only what is real. Hale did not move toward him. He did not need to. There are moments when justice does not chase a man down the hall. It simply follows him in his own mind until he can no longer outrun it. The apology that came was smaller than the harm that had been done, but it was still a beginning. The voice that spoke it was quieter now, almost fragile. No longer carrying the hard edge of entitlement that had once filled the room so easily. Hale listened without triumph. That too was part of the lesson. Real authority does not need to celebrate when someone finally understands the damage they caused. It only needs to witness the change and decide whether it is sincere. Around them, people who had stood frozen before now began to breathe again. A clerk reached for a file with trembling hands. A deputy looked away, embarrassed by his own earlier silence. A woman near the back wiped at her eyes and pretended it was only dust. The building itself seemed to exhale. Every wall, every polished surface, every sealed door had held the memory of what happened, and now that memory was spreading through the courthouse like a current. By afternoon, the story had already moved beyond the chamber. It passed from one office to another, from one phone call to the next, until everyone who mattered knew that the matter had been resolved, not by noise but by restraint, not by force but by clarity. That was what made it unforgettable. Hale later walked past the same bench where the man had sat with folded arms and a fixed smirk, and for a brief moment the past and present touched. He thought about how often people confuse position with power, and power with the right to diminish others. He thought about how quickly that illusion can break when character steps into the light. There had been no need for a grand display. No need for the room to be overturned. The truth had done all the work. And once the truth speaks, everything built on pride begins to lose its shape. The man at the center of it all would carry that realization for a long time. He would feel it in the quiet before sleep, in the pause before a sentence, in the hesitation that now lived behind his eyes. That is how consequence works, when it is rooted in conscience. It does not vanish when the crowd leaves. It stays. It teaches. It humbles. And somewhere deep beneath the shame, it offers the possibility of becoming better than the person who first walked into that room. Hale understood that. He also understood something else. Dignity is not fragile. It does not break just because someone attempts to step on it. It can bend under pressure, it can be tested by cruelty, but it survives. And when it survives, it becomes unmistakable. That was what the room had seen, even if only for a moment. That was what the man would remember, even if he wished he would not. And that was why the silence afterward felt heavier than any argument could have. Because in that silence, justice had already spoken, and there was no going back from what it revealed. The silence from that room did not fade when the doors closed behind them. It followed Hale like a shadow he could not outrun. He sat for a long moment in the quiet afterwards, staring at his own hands, as if they belonged to someone else, as if he could still feel the weight of every word that had been spoken, and every assumption that had collapsed under its own arrogance. The truth had not arrived with a shout. It had arrived with patience, with witness, with restraint, and that made it heavier. Across the hall, the woman he had tried to dismiss stood with the same steady posture she had carried through everything else. No triumph on her face, no hunger for humiliation. Only that calm, unshaken dignity that made the room feel smaller around her. Imagine standing there after being underestimated by someone who mistook silence for weakness and realizing that you never needed to raise your voice once for the truth to win. That was the kind of power she carried. Not the loud kind. The kind that remained when the noise was gone. Hale looked up when the commissioner entered, followed by two senior officials whose presence changed the air in an instant. Nobody announced them. They did not need to be announced. They carried themselves with the quiet certainty of people who had already seen the report, already heard. The testimony already understood what had happened here. Hale rose too quickly, then stopped, uncertain whether standing made him look respectful or simply afraid. The commissioner did not speak to him at first. Instead, his attention moved to the woman, and his expression softened with something like recognition, something like regret. "Thank you for staying composed," he said carefully, his voice measured and sincere. "Not everyone in your position would have handled this with such restraint." She gave a small nod. Restraint was the only thing that made room for the truth. The words landed without force, yet they carried farther than any accusation could have. Hale swallowed hard. He had spent so long believing authority meant volume, that control meant dominance, that being heard required making others smaller. Now he was beginning to understand that real authority did not need to perform itself. It simply entered a room and changed the temperature. One of the senior officials opened a folder and placed it on the table. Inside were the notes, the witness summaries, the recorded statements, and the internal findings that had already begun to turn this moment into a permanent record. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. That was what made it unbearable for Hale. Every page was another reminder that consequence did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrived like paperwork, like signatures, like decisions made in rooms where names mattered more than appearances. The commissioner finally turned toward him. "You are relieved of your duties. Pending review," he said. "Effective immediately, you will surrender your badge, your service weapon, and your access credentials before you leave this building." Hale stood frozen, the words sinking in slowly, each one precise and final. He had expected anger. He had expected shouting. He had expected the kind of punishment he could fight against. But this was something else. This was order. This was accountability, speaking in a calm, unmistakable voice. He looked at the woman then, and for the first time, he did not see a target or a problem or a person he could control. He saw a human being whose dignity had outlasted his cruelty. He saw the kind of strength that does not need applause to be real. His throat tightened, I was wrong, he said, the sentence barely holding together. It was not enough. He knew that. She knew that. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is the first honest thing a person has left. She did not move closer. She did not make it easier for him. She simply answered with the same calm honesty that had carried her through everything. Being wrong is not the worst part, she said. Refusing to see it is. And in that one line, the last excuse inside him finally gave way. Because justice was never only about punishment. It was about recognition. It was about the moment a person is forced to see what they have become and decide whether they will remain there. Hale lowered his gaze and the room stayed quiet around him, not with mercy but with truth. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the windows in long pale bands, washing the hallway in a softness that felt almost sacred. People moved beyond the glass. Life continued. But inside that room something permanent had changed. The lie had been stripped away. The mask had fallen, and what remained was the plain, unforgettable fact that dignity had stood its ground and won without needing to become cruel in return. That was the kind of justice the day had revealed. Not loud, not dramatic. Final, in its own quiet way. And once it had spoken, there was no unhearing it. There was only living with what it meant. I can continue the story in a cinematic YouTube-safe way, but I cannot help produce racist or hateful content. If you want, I can write Part 9 as a justice-driven courtroom or authority reveal scene with the same tense emotional style while keeping it safe and respectful.